Our question for Al Bielek is to describe what you remember about those 6 weeks that you spent in 2137 and perhaps implications of that experience for our immediate future.
Well, it's really what you just asked. The question was really two parts, but I will give it to you in terms of the way you asked it. The first part, what is the implication of the 6 weeks there? Detail, there's not a great deal of detail I can recall on that, other than the fact that I was in a hospital bed for 4 weeks and in the hospital itself for another 2 weeks, with Duncan in a bed adjacent to me. And this, of course, is after we jumped off the Eldridge. And the first 4 weeks basically was physically recovering from the damage which had occurred, which were, at that time, little was known about this problem, but it is known now. If you go out into space or even a hyperspace, there are all kinds of radiations out there which can be highly damaging to the body. And that's exactly what happened to us. We had no protective suits on, no protective clothing, and when we arrived in 2137, as they told us, we were in pretty bad physical shape, that we had been severely burned in our trip through hyperspace, space, or whatever the term was they used. And they had to have us recover and put us back together, as it were. There wasn't physical damage in the sense of an injury. There was damage in the sense of radiation and what the radiation did to the physiology of the body. But while there, of course, watching TV, as it was TV, and they had in this hospital room TV sets, and one for me and I guess one for Duncan.
Were they a little different than the kinds of TV sets we know now in the year 2000?
Very little different. They were color TVs. There were screens mounted on a swivel unit up on the ceiling, so you could control the angle at which it was down and the direction in which it was swiveled towards you, so it would be aimed straight at you. The sound could come out of the ceiling speaker or it could come from ear sets, whichever you preferred. And there was program selection. You had an automatic control for that, just like we have remotes for today.
Do you recall what TV programs you watched?
Mostly, I think what one would call current history for that time. News talk, historical stuff, geographical stuff, and soap operas as we know them today. I don't recall there was a single one on the air. There was much more in the way of an educational channel than anything else. It wasn't entertainment as I saw it. I do not recall that there was an entertainment channel per se, because at first I didn't know where we were. I didn't know what had happened. And eventually I started seeing some very strange things on TV. I started asking questions. And the first thing I noted was references geographically to the United States, and I noticed severe changes in the coastlines and the interior, and the fact that Europe didn't look at all like when I had remembered it. And I started asking questions. What's happened? What's been going on? That's when they said, I want to see maps of what's happened and some description. I said, it looks like there's been major earth changes. And they said, yes, there have been. It all happened in the period between the beginning of the 21st century and basically the year 2025. All right, what happened? So they told me, they showed me maps, and to describe it briefly, the east coast of the United States was rather heavily changed, not as much as the west coast, but neither one for that matter. None of the changes I saw would fit some of the very far out maps promulgated in the late 20th century by various people such as the I Am America group and Michael Gordon Scallion and his series of maps. They were what I would consider the worst case possible scenario, and it didn't happen that way. But what I did see was changes in the East Coast, particularly when you went south towards where Georgia, Carolinas and Georgia is. The Georgia coastline had gone inland, so that Atlanta, instead of being about 100 miles from the ocean, was only 3 miles from the ocean. A lot of the east coast of Georgia was gone. Parts of North Carolina had been chopped off. Florida was gone completely except for the area of the Panhandle.
Was this on the TV programs that you
I
saw,
saw
or did they give you a
references.
map?
I saw this in references on the TV program,
Okay.
which they showed pictures of the coastline in reference to something else that we're dealing with. And I see this. I said, "What is this? This isn't the way I remember it." So that's when I started asking what's going on, and they gave me the maps. The Gulf Coast was drastically changed. There was about a 50-mile wide swath north of where we knew the Gulf Coast to be, as it is today, in the beginning of the 21st century. And about 50 miles wide was just gone. It was underwater, which means New Orleans was gone, Houston was gone, Corpus Christi, Texas was gone as such, though it was just barely, because that's a little higher ground there. It was just lowlands that went. And I don't think it was geographic upheaval. It was just a case of the ocean waters have been rising, plus other changes. And the big change in the middle of the country was that the Mississippi became an inland waterway, and a rather wide one, all the way up to the Great Lakes, which then became one lake. Part of the original lakes disappeared, and other parts sank, so that you had one large lake there, which joined with the St. Lawrence Seaway, which became a very large seaway. And the rest of the U.S., the western part, to the other side of the new Mississippi Basin, if you will, was all there, essentially intact, with the exception of California and parts of Oregon and small parts of Washington. California suffered from where the San Andreas Fault came inland. San Andreas Fault cuts into California between San Francisco and San Jose. That's where it cuts inland and is no longer in the ocean, but is cutting across land. And it goes down basically central California, so that when you get past Los Angeles, it winds up cutting through the middle of the Salton Sea. And much of that section west of that fault line, of the San Andreas Fault line, wound up in the ocean, not all of it. San Diego was gone, parts of Southern California was gone, but the strange part was where Los Angeles was, parts of it were still left. The coastal sections, the beach country was gone. The beach areas were collapsed, the cliffs were collapsed. But areas of the higher sections of Beverly Hills were still there. Altadena, Pasadena was still there. Downtown Los Angeles is still referred to as the island, because it was on a rock, and there's literally an island there, even now, though it's certainly not underwater, but it winds up being surrounded by water. So there were a lot of changes that way, and of course came with that, not just the geographical changes, but total collapse of the infrastructure of the United States. And at that time, 2137, there was no longer any reference to the United States as a nation, or to Canada as a nation. They still use the geographical outlines of the old states and the countries for reference. But at that time, the banks were heavily curtailed, banking systems had changed drastically, computers were very much in, if you will, and the government was very much smaller and streamlined, though what was still functioning was largely under military control. There was still, even in 2137, at least in the U.S., largely a, shall we say, a residual of martial law. The military was still running things. The civilian government was gone, just plain gone.
Was it, as we know, this one world order?
No, the one world order at that point was non-existent. Now, in between the period of, let's say now, 2000 AD and 2137, I had very little data as to what happened to the New World Order. All they told me was that the New World Order collapsed. They didn't say when or how or whether there was a world war in between or not. There was a war. But whether it was due to the New World Order instigating it in order to try and preserve their status or not was not made that clear to me.
So was it still the United States military that was controlling everything for the United States area, or was it just a regional military?
At that point, there's a little bit of both. It was a residual of the United States military, but it was more a regional military than strictly U.S. government military.
Did you meet any of the military people?
Not that I can recall this time. I don't believe I did. First of all, I never got out of the hospital until I made my famous trip to the next stop. But while I was in 2137, I never got outside the hospital. My view of 2137 was through the TV screen, and other information was brought to me at my request.
So you never actually left the hospital, did you?
No.
You're in it, and were you right beside your brother Duncan at the same time?
Basically. Plus we got up and wandered around the hospital building after we got well. But we didn't leave the building. We were sort of, I guess one would say, in protective custody.
So have you ever asked the question, were you really in 2137?
Oh, I asked them the year. Yes, and they said it was 2137 A.D. And how can this be? Well, you came or brought to us, and we're not quite sure how you got here, but you were brought to us as found somewheres, and you were in terrible physical shape. You know, we treated you as a regular, ordinary patient with unknown origins. But at that time, apparently, they didn't worry about did you have Medicare, Medicaid, or the money to pay for it. This was already, shall we say, socialism of a sort. Mm-hmm. I did not inquire to that extent as to the financial status, except I did ask about banks and banking systems and financial status, and they said it was drastically changed. Yeah, there was still money, but it was not quite the same as it had been. And banks were progressively curtailed from the amount of power that they once had.
Did you notice anything different in the hospital, though, that would show that there was 137 years had gone by from today's date? Or did it look pretty much the same as today's hospitals?
It looked very nearly the same as today's hospitals. The only thing I could say was that the medical treatment was much more advanced. They used relatively little drugs or shots. There were other types of techniques that were used. What they did give us in the way of medication was not anything we recognized. Of course, I was not a doctor then or now, and I wouldn't recognize by name many of the drugs and medications they gave us. But I know that some of that stuff bore no resemblance to anything that we use today. And they did make mention of that. And he says, the 20th century medicine, we don't practice that here anymore. He says, we've gotten a little bit away from that, going ahead. They did use other types of therapy, which would come under the terminology today of perhaps holistic medicine. Perhaps one could say various vibrational treatments, light treatments. Of course, if there was surgery required, they had those techniques available, much more refined than today. I did ask some questions in that direction. There was a city outside, but that was one of the things I learned in watching TV. Many of the cities that we know today didn't exist anymore. And some of them were in the status of, you might say, a museum being rebuilt as a museum rather than as a habitation.
Did you get any feel for how many people were actually on the planet at that time?
Yes, I asked that question, and they said at that time about 300 million on the entire planet.
That's all?
That's all. In the United States, less than 100 million. There's about 50.
And what happened to the 6 billion that are here today?
That is something that I never got a fully straight answer to, but they told me this, that between the World War III, disease, famine, breakdown of government, lack of transportation, the total collapse of finance, wars with the aliens, the fact that certain alien groups arrived and were rather carnivorous, they liked human flesh. There was a great deal of problem in the big cities. Most of the inhabitants wound up being, shall we say, grist for the tables of the aliens while they lasted. They did not last that long. They were eventually run out, destroyed, or what have you. But
by
not
who? Who destroyed?
By the military of the United States and the militias also. The militias got involved heavily in the act. The UN attempted to fight some of this for a while, but apparently they were overwhelmed also. And eventually the UN was troops and such. Or let's say the UN agenda, as we understand it right now of this year, fell by the wayside. There was no longer any attempt to make a one-world government. There wasn't enough left to make a one-world government of.
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because we always think of the aliens as having technology that is so far advanced of ours that if they want to, they could basically do whatever they want to do. But it seems like as up to this point, 2000, they're in a fairly passive or behind-the-scenes role. But you're saying that the U.S. military actually developed technology to beat them.
We have all of the technology that most of the aliens ever had, because there was a lot of cooperative effort between 1954 and the year 2000. And we back-engineered not only their craft and their drives and their weapons, excuse me, but we also, perhaps one could say, forward-engineered from the knowledge we acquired of the alien approaches to weapons and weapon systems. We forward-engineered a few of our own. And as an example, as of now, that is the year 2000, we have particle beam weapon systems, which I might note were first noted and developed by Nikola Tesla back in the 30s, about 1935. And without going through the long history of how we came back into it, what he started out with is a basically medium-powered device. Today, that is in the last 10 years, has become an exceedingly high-powered weapon, where they can aim it from the Earth out into space, and with one of the systems I am told they have today, they can quite literally punch a hole through a moon on Jupiter, and have done so as a demonstration or a test for the benefit of outsiders who might have the idea that they can come to Earth and conquer us and get away with it rather readily. The day was and they could. Not anymore today.
So what year did you get the sense that all the problems started?
Approximately between 2003 and 2005. At that time, the brief history that I acquired at that time, meaning in 2137, indicated that the New World Order was consolidating quite heavily their gains and their control over the planet. But something went wrong somewhere. Somebody blinked when they shouldn't have, or whatever it was, but suddenly erupted a war, which was basically between, as I understand it now and remember what they told me, between the Russians and Chinese on one side and the U.S. on the other, and also the Europe essentially on our side. There was an unprovoked attack with very little warning or no warning. It hit several American cities, and we retaliated.
Was it a nuclear attack?
Yes, it was a nuclear attack with the ICBMs, full bore. And whether it was a case of they were allowed to hit us first, as Clinton has said in the current era while he is still president, that if there is such an attack ever occurs, we will fully absorb it. Instead of trying to fight it out in space and prevent it from getting here, his intent is to let it hit here. That's part of the plan. In any case, they did. They wiped out a number of cities, and we retaliated because we have thousands of the missiles. They're all over. I do not know where they all are, but I know that many of these silos which have been deactivated is the tip of the iceberg. We have so many thousands of missiles buried all over the United States and Canada and other locations that could knock out all of the known sites, which, of course, I'm sure the Russians and Chinese know. The sites we still have in reserve would be more than enough to wipe them out.
Did you ever hear who was the president at the time that this attack happened?
That's a good question. I don't think I ever asked. If I remember right, that was one of the complications that occurred at the time. The current race between Gore, Bush, and of course the Independent Party, Reform Party candidate, Buchanan. Yeah, I remember correctly, it wound up in the House. The House had to resolve it.
Had to resolve the election?
Yes, because there was not 266 electoral votes for anyone. They were split three ways. And eventually, I think they did pull Bush as the closest to winning, and they gave him the honor, if you will, of becoming the president. That's my vague recollection now, but it was from that point on things started to come unglued, because I know from current politics, Buchanan would not tolerate any of the things that were happening now in terms of the UN and certain other aspects. Bush was thrust into it, and he became very upset when he found out what was really going on behind the scenes. He was not fully primed by either his father or anyone else. He was left in ignorance until he actually became president. Until you become the president, you're not privy to an awful lot of information, which only the president has, and he doesn't get it all either. But in any case, things became very unstable from that point on.
From the point of the actual election?
From the point of the final election results, right, and fact that the presidency was a little bit rocky from that point on. The government became unstable, and then about 2003 came the war. And then in that same time period, about 2003 on, whether or not the missile attacks triggered part of this or not, I'm not sure, but the earth changes, which have been threatening to hit, started to hit with a vengeance. For the period of about 2003 to, they said, about 2012, there was a series of heavy earthquakes and other earth changes which drastically changed our coastlines.
What do you think actually caused these earth changes?
It is very hard to answer because I don't think even a geologist could answer that properly. They were imminent in the sense that certain of the geographical formations, such as Area 51 in Nevada, is known now to be unstable. Certain areas in Italy are known to be unstable. We've gotten that feedback from somebody who had been over there, shall we say, dealing with the Vatican for a possible removal of all of their records to a much safer place. They said that the infrastructure underground is starting to crack. And it says, we know it's going to go, and we don't want to lose the records.
Under the Vatican?
Under the Vatican. As a matter of the record, because I talked with the person who made the tour at the invitation of the Vatican and the Pope to see what they are talking about in the terms of preservation of records. He saw what they had. 18 miles of underground records and storage. Miles. Everything from Atlantis on back, as well as everything from the point of Atlantis forward. They have it.
Yeah, I believe 60 Minutes actually did a special where they got inside on some of that.
Yeah.
We're able to be shown some of that, but yes, it just goes on and on
and
and on.
And on and on.
And it's a well-known fact.
It's a fairly well-known fact. It's not too well-known. Only one friend of mine actually saw the whole 9 yards of it, and he was given specifically the tour to evaluate, can you handle this? Mm-hmm. And he was told that they wanted to move this stuff out of there. They had hoped that he would do it, and he said he was interested in doing it on an interactive basis, that whatever files and records were put into storage would be made available on computers. They did not disagree with that. But the problem was the logistics and the money. As of now, I don't think my friend still has the money lined up to do it. He wanted to do it in western Colorado, in an area that he knows is very stable. But they're talking about hundreds of millions of bucks.
Well, when did the Vatican ever have any problem with money?
That's a very good question. I've never known them to have a problem with money. Now, why they were putting him on the spot, I don't know.
So, to your recollection, you know there were some major earth changes that did occur, but the exact reason still a little bit foggy.
Exactly. Like, for example, Mount St. Helens blew up, of course, in our era.
Right.
Nobody knows why it did. It did. There was something unstable. Who knows what the structure below the earth is, when it is going to trigger. They know at certain areas that it will, but nobody can predict when.
Well, the type of earth changes you're talking about, a magnetic pole shift could cause something like that.
Yes.
Well, did you hear about that at all?
Yes, now that you mention it. The magnetic poles did start to shift, but the data I was given was that they were able to finally stabilize not only the magnetic but the geographic pole structure, so that with the technology was available to us even before the end of the 20th century, they could put artificial poles up at the area where the magnetic poles are now, both north and south, create an artificial pole structure to prevent the complete collapse and the reversal. And they did this and prevented the collapse and reversal and other problems it would have created, and also, as a byproduct, stabilized the geographic poles.
But it doesn't sound like they were successful.
Oh, they were successful. The poles never flipped. It stabilized that aspect of it, but other things occurred in terms of the other geographic anomalies. The major problems which developed are unknown as to why.
What about all those cities that were, say, bombed out by nuclear bombs? From what I understand, is that city is no one can live in it for hundreds of years.
Well, according to current knowledge, thousands of years, because it takes that long for the radiation to die down. There is, though, even today, technology that can reduce that radiation risk down to minimal levels in a matter of days or weeks. The technology exists, but the government won't use it, even on our waste. We have enormous amounts of nuclear waste, which constitute a very major problem, and the government will not use it. They're using it in Europe.
Why? Why won't they use it?
Politics, and I cannot give you an answer as to why they won't. Nobody can give an answer on that. The best scientists who know this techniques. Some 6 different systems are available. They won't use it.
So you're guessing that the technology existed to sort of counteract the effects of the nuclear radiation in the cities. So
they can damp that out, and unless the city was totally devastated physically to the point where it isn't worth rebuilding, in which case there'd just be a slag heap and they abandon it, post a sign here and say, here was such and such city. Other than that, they can rebuild it. I know Atlanta was hit by not nuclear missiles because they wanted it to be the headquarters of the New World Order, eastern half of the United States, but it was eventually hit by ordinary shells, if you will, an ordinary bombardment, which was not successful in producing severe destruction to the city. It drove all what was left of the residents out. The military came and sealed it off, and then there was an ongoing battle between, as I remember, UN and Patriots, in which the UN lost. And eventually, eventually Atlanta was restored. And they told me about that, and they were still working on the final touches of it in 2137.
So who are the they? We've met your doctors. Who are the they that you're talking about?
Whatever was existing in the way of a government in 2137. There was a government of sorts.
No, I mean, did they actually come into your hospital room and talk to you, or are you getting this from the television that you watch?
I'm getting part of it from television, partly from the medical people and others who came in and talked with us.
Okay, but no government official or anybody. You apparently...
I cannot recall a government official per se coming to talk with us.
So you apparently, after you jumped off the Eldridge, somehow, and I guess you don't remember it, you were perhaps unconscious at the time.
We were.
Someone found you, or some group of people found you, took you to the hospital, but apparently the people in the hospital and everybody else didn't really know that you came from, what was it, 1943?
It would have been from 1943.
Right.
I do not know at this point whether they knew it or not. If they did, they kept their mouth shut. That's for sure.
But no one interrogated you, asked you any questions, said where
they
are you
didn't
from?
interrogate us as such. Apparently they already knew more about the history from the year 2000, actually from the year 1943 on, than we did. Therefore, it would have been a wasted effort. But we were there for quite a period of time, and...
well, how did you eventually go from this year 2000 up, back? How did you go back?
Well, we didn't go back from 2137. The next interesting step that occurred, and I still can't explain that, how it happened, as I already outlined previously, I wound up in the year 2749, was pulled up there. By what means and by whom, I do not know. 2749 to 2751, almost a full 2 years. I have no idea how I got there. Duncan was not with me on that trip. He remained behind. And as I outlined previously, I spent almost 2 years there, learning about their society and civilization, the wing makers who were in back of the synthetic intelligence computer systems that ran every city on the planet. Plus, everything had been totally rebuilt, and by that time there was no government other than the synthetic intelligence computer system, and those who were in back of it who designed it and were still running it.
I mean, that's 600 years.
Yes.
Past that point, so a lot can happen in 600 years.
A lot can happen in 600 years, and did.
I'm sure. Wow.
So from that point, I was sent back to 2137 to get Duncan, and then go to 1983.
Okay, so you went from 2137 to 2749, stay there till 51.
Right.
And then did you go from 51 back to 37?
Yes.
To get Duncan?
To 2137 to get Duncan.
And then once you got Duncan, then what happened?
Then we were transferred by, again, means unknown, and how this happened I can't even begin to explain because I don't know, to the incident I usually describe in my lectures, where we arrived at night in a military base next to a chain link fence with a helicopter overhead shining a spotlight down on us when we were taken into the underground of Montauk to meet Dr. John von Neumann. And at that point, we didn't even have a memory of where we had been, E2137 or maybe up to the 20th century. That was wiped all we remembered was coming off of the Eldridge. And that, of course, later on created a great deal of confusion. On my part, I should say. And Duncan never did remember any of the other trips. He has, to this day, I believe, not remembered any part of the 2137, or of course, he would not remember the 28th century. He was not there. How those memories finally seep back, of course, is a long story of my own. But at that point, when we arrived there at the night of August 12th, or I should say the morning, about 2 a.m. of August 12th, 1983, everything was wiped for the other parts of the trip.
And just in closing, do you have any idea what technique was used to wipe your memory at that time?
Nothing. Obviously highly advanced technology, of which today we would have no knowledge.
So do you think it was the people from 2749?
I suspect it was them, for the simple reason that they sent me back, and they said, you have to go back into the past to straighten out a mess.
And how did they send you back? Was it the same type of portal that you've been accustomed to?
It was not anything like the jumping off the Eldridge and going through that routine, or the type of portal that existed there, which was a function partly to lock up the fields from Montauk and the Eldridge. It was some other type of more advanced system. I do know that the guys in the future, that is the wingmakers, have an extremely advanced system for time travel, interactive time travel they call it, which scientists in our era, that is the 20th century, having discovered the Wingmaker site, claim we don't have. I don't agree with them. We have it, but it's perhaps very much cruder than the refinements they have in another 8 centuries.
So physically, I guess you don't have much memory of the apparatus that was used.
I have no memory of the apparatus at all.
Okay. All right, well, we'll end that there. Thank you, Al.